Welcome back. I'm Peter St. Onge. This is a weekly roundup of my daily videos on the economy and freedom, where I cut through the BS and lay out what the gaslighting clowns pulled out of their hats this week and what is coming next. Four months into Trump, inflation is in full retreat and wages are soaring at the fastest pace since May of 2021, back when pandemic labor shortages were pumping artificial wages. The good news comes from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, who reports that personal income last month rose $210 billion, a 10% annualized rate. That follows strong numbers in Trump's previous 3 months, doubling the rate of income growth compared to Biden's last year. The income number blew away Wall Street expectations. In fact, it was triple what the market expected, perhaps because Wall Street's Bloomberg terminals told them Orange Man bad. Even better, inflation came in at just 1.2% annualized on the Fed's preferred index, the PCE. That's also half Joe Biden's final year. It's actually 1/5 Joe Biden's final month. Put them together, and in 4 months, Trump has made up over half the income losses of Biden's 4 years. The biggest number last week was the trade deficit, which collapsed by half to just $88 billion, down from $162. This drove the Fed's GDP model to now predicting 3.8% GDP growth for this quarter, which is very good. Now, you may recall just a few weeks ago, GDP was negative, and I said, don't worry. Well, this is why. That negative print was partly falling government spending, which is good for growth since government was wasting it. But it was mostly tariff front-running, companies importing ahead of Trump's big, beautiful tariffs. That matters because imports mechanically subtract from official GDP numbers, but companies import stuff because they plan to sell it, at which point it turns into future GDP, either consumption from cars to clothes to pool floats, or investment from imported tractors and backhoes to industrial machinery. Now, media, of course, ran with the negative number because they have a story to sell, and they figure the audience will forget when that 3.8% GDP comes in. So what's next? Most of Trump's economic agenda is rocket fuel for incomes. So cutting taxes, cutting red tape, cutting government spending, all boost production and return resources to the American people where they can do something useful. Meanwhile, deportations mean American workers do not have to compete with third world wages. Even tariffs, which usually don't boost wages, are currently pulling in historic rates of foreign investment, $5 trillion in just 4 months. That would double investment in the American economy and drive up wages for American workers building factories and infrastructure. And if Trump can actually close some trade deals, it could permanently drive up wages. More could be done, of course. Democrats and their pet judges are doing everything they can to block deportations. Rhinos in Congress are doing everything they can to keep government spending trillions while the American people do without. But Trump doubling income growth and cutting inflation in half is pretty impressive for 4 months, especially with zero help from the Fed or Congress. The main concern from here is government spending. If rhinos in Congress don't cut, it could drive inflation back up, returning us to the Biden-era treadmill of incomes trying or failing to outrun prices. There's some hopeful signs from the Senate, with fiscal conservatives demanding more spending cuts out of the big, beautiful budget. If that happens, we're in store for a lot more big, beautiful numbers on the economy. Europe's welfare state is going bankrupt. Is America watching? Le canary in the coal mine. Last week, France's Court of Government Auditors sounded the alarm that social spending has, quote, spiraled out of control, warning that a, quote, liquidity crisis could be coming as soon as 2027 that could shut France out of financial markets. The main driver, of course, is mass migration, which has driven France's fiscal deficit to over 5% of GDP, with the social deficit set to soar by 50% in a single year. Now, the government had been cooking the books to try and hide it, since migrant welfare is, of course, unpopular, but the Court of Auditors redid the numbers, concluding the government has, quote, lost control of public finances. The IMF even weighed in, urging structural reform to cut France's social spending given weak economic growth. Yes, the IMF, who normally lectures African countries. The background here is the French economy is crawling, with GDP growth projected at just 0.7% for 2025, yet social spending is exploding as France's ruling class imports a fresh crop of third world voters, A 2022 study estimated that 1/3 of France's population is already migrant origin, and new migrants go on welfare at 2.5 times the rate of the French. This is true across the European Union, slow growth and exploding migrant welfare. It could get a lot worse if the tariff war with Trump takes European growth negative, even as Europe's left continues importing an estimated 4 million migrants per year, overwhelmingly from third world countries. Meanwhile, Europe is frantically building its military, a warfare state to go with the welfare state, since Trump doesn't want to pay for their wars anymore. The EU plans to plow $840 billion into military, and Bloomberg estimates that could ultimately come to $3 trillion in an economy that's just 2/3 the size of the U.S. So Europe's economy is flatlining even as trillions are dumped into third world migration and pointless wars. You gotta love socialism. Interestingly, there are a few countries in Europe that have had enough, and the EU is trying to crush them. Hungary's populist leader Viktor Orban has fought mass migration and the war in Ukraine, and in response, the European Union has slapped over $500 million of fines on Hungary for failing to accept migrants. In U.S. GDP terms, that's a $65 billion fine. Meanwhile, Hungary is trying to block new money for the meat grinder in Ukraine, in response to which 16 left-wing EU countries are literally threatening to strip Hungary of its voting rights. That's like stripping a U.S. state senators and representatives. So as next, Europe is falling apart economically and socially. In the long run, America's actually in worse shape on government spending, with a federal deficit that's almost twice as big as the EU. It's even bigger than France. The big, beautiful budget will make it even worse unless Republicans in the Senate grow a spine. The rule of thumb is politicians don't fix it until they have to, which usually means a crisis. So maybe the best we can hope for is a crisis in one country, or one European Union, that concentrates minds here in America. A word from our sponsor. The United States now has a strategic Bitcoin reserve. It's not speculation, it's official policy. Unchained and the Bitcoin Policy Institute are breaking it all down in a new report with a live panel called The Strategic Bitcoin Reserve Era Begins. If you care about the future of Bitcoin, you'll want to be there. Visit unchained.com/PSO to register and read the report. If you own gold or silver, you know they're a great hedge against financial instability and let you grow your wealth outside the banking system and gain greater control over your finances. Monetary Metals offers you the ability to increase your precious metal ounces every single month. Instead of paying to own metal, with Monetary Metals, you get paid 4% on your gold paid in more ounces. Now's the time to secure your wealth and build your legacy in an asset that the government cannot inflate away. Join thousands of investors earning interest in physical gold and silver every month with Monetary Metals. Visit monetarymetals.com/Peter to learn more. Now back to our show. Will exploding federal deficits spark a financial crisis to rival 2008? Will we be eating cat food again? Last week, two influential mainstreamers, Ray Dalio and Jamie Dimon, warned a financial crisis is coming now that federal deficits are projected at nearly $3 trillion per year for the next decade, courtesy of Republicans in Congress. For perspective, before COVID, $1 trillion was a crazy number on the deficit. Before the 2008 crisis, it was $500 billion that got the headlines under W. We thought that was bad. The first warning came from Dalio, founder of the world's largest hedge fund, Bridgewater. He warned of a, quote, breakdown in bond markets as roughly $10 trillion of federal debt looks for buyers this year. When there's not enough buyers, it drives down bond prices, which automatically drives up interest rates and incidentally crashes banks, which we saw in 2023, when interest rates rose thanks to the Fed. Now, that all drives up the cost of borrowing in the entire economy, strangling businesses and driving up mortgages, credit cards, and car loans, which squeezes consumers and historically leads to recessions. And the only way to head that off is for the Fed to jump in and, quote, print money. As in, the Fed fires up their basement computers, types a bunch of zeros on an Excel sheet, and uses those counterfeit dollars to buy trillions of dollars in bonds. The official term for this is quantitative easing, which sounds better than counterfeiting. So in short, either they let rates cause a recession or they let inflation rip. The solution, of course, is don't pump out so much debt into bond markets. that's currently overwhelmingly a government thing. Roughly 80% of debt issuance in the entire American economy is the federal government. The rest of us make do with crumbs. The other warning came from Jamie Dimon, the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase, the world's biggest bank. He thinks federal deficits are now so big we are, quote, going to see a crack in bond markets that will send governments into, quote, panic. Panic here meaning trillion-dollar bailouts. Now, Dimon, of course, knows his bailouts. He was one of the lead architects of the trillions Wall Street got in 2008, as well as the autopilot bailouts in 2023 that had Janet Yellen cover $20 trillion in bank deposits. With just $100 billion at the FDIC, that is a 2% cover, par for the course for the feds. The difference is back then, Dimon was not warning. He was busy counting J.P. Morgan profits on the subprime loan crisis. Today, he is telling us it's coming, adding if there's a crisis, quote, Chase will make more money. People will probably say we caused it. We like crisis, but if we don't change the trajectory of federal debt, it is coming. So this is not Peter Schiff or skies falling permabears. These are two of the most establishment players warning of a coming crisis. So what's next? With congressional Republicans giving up on spending cuts, making a mockery of Doge, there is nobody flying the plane. Perhaps the best we can hope for is to root for that bond market crack as bond investors, so-called bond vigilantes, demand higher and higher rates, forcing Washington to face the consequences of its spending, the recession or inflation it takes to finally cut that spending. Unfortunately, as always, voters will also be facing those consequences. The United Nations is sounding the alarm that they will have to lay off 7,000 corrupt bureaucrats, or dedicated public servants, amid a 20% budget cut as contributions dry up, most notably from the Trump administration. It is a great start. Where do we get more? Now, your first question might be, what the heck are 37,000 people doing at the UN? 37,000 is actually just the tip of the iceberg. The UN has an entire rat's nest of agencies who employ roughly 130,000 people in all. That includes 7,000 at the World Health Organization, famous for imposing experimental vaccines, 10,000 between UNICEF and FAO, famous for wiping out third world farmers and stealing school rehabilitation money, 18,000 in the UN Refugee Agency, famous for literally joining in the October 7th attack on Israel, and of course, roughly 76,000 so-called peacekeepers who are basically Bangladeshis stationed in Africa where they watch civil wars and, according to a brutal 2005 report, engage in the kind of conduct that would make Jeffrey Epstein blush. Of course, almost none of these 130,000 UN employees are American, despite being based in New York so that Americans can cover the bills. In dollars, this army of corrupt grifters consumes roughly $67 billion per year, of which about 1 in 4 comes from the American taxpayer. So that's more than $15 billion, for perspective, about 5 times what we spend on the National Park Service. So what does America get for $15 billion aside from the waste and the fraud? So the UN was originally sold as a way for the U.S. to impose its will on the world. Of course, it flipped, since one country, one vote means tiny countries use the UN to gang up on the U.S. Essentially a cartel of midgets who have zero power on their own, but give them a vote and presto, they got leverage on the American people and the American taxpayer. So what do they do with this power? In its 80 years, the UN has imposed a parade of treaties that erode fundamental American rights, from overriding our laws on family rights, gender issues, Second Amendment, and juvenile justice, to mining, manufacturing, global warming, and, of course, the COVID lockdowns. One 1951 UN treaty is a key driver of the migrant crisis in the West, giving refugees rights that native-born could only dream of. So what's next? The question is, how do we ditch the UN? On February 4th, Trump signed an executive order giving 180 days to review American participation and funding of all international organizations, as in not just the UN, but the IMF, World Bank, OECD, NATO. There's a lot of them. Treasury Secretary Bessent recently said we need a, quote, reordering of these organizations so they promote America instead of fighting it. Personally, I'd rather just walk away. The U.S. is the global Goliath with a quarter of the world economy, more than half of global military spending. But stick us in some international organization and we flip from Goliath to sucker at the table. So the good news is Trump is skeptical of this entire so-called international community, UN and all. The bad news is I'm not sure he realizes they cannot be saved. A word from our sponsor. One of the best ways to secure your Bitcoin is with a hardware wallet, a physical device that lets you keep your coins offline without internet connection. One of the most trusted names in hardware wallets is CoinKite, maker of the famous block clock. CoinKite devices are made in Canada and they're run by passionate Bitcoiners who've been at this since 2012, back when Bitcoiners were trading in person at swap meets. You can pick up hardware wallets and plenty of other goodies at coinkite.com/ProfSaintAnge. That's CoinKite.com/ProfSaintAnge. Okay, back to our show. Elon Musk says the big beautiful budget is in fact a, quote, disgusting pork-filled abomination that will drive America into debt slavery. He is not alone. Senator Ron Johnson calls the cuts, quote, wimpy and anemic. Congressman Tom Massey calls the bill a ticking time bomb. So can we fix it? The so-called big beautiful bill is part of the annual budget for next year. It's not the whole budget. They'll do an additional one to handle so-called discretionary spending, which is everything government spends outside welfare and government benefits like Medicaid. The problem, of course, is big beautiful cuts almost nothing. The cuts are overwhelmingly postponed to a future Congress, while these spending hikes are immediate. This means it raises the deficit by at least $4 trillion over the next decade, which would bring annual deficits to $2.5 trillion in the near term, stretching towards $3 trillion in a few years. Meanwhile, it helpfully raises the debt ceiling by $4 trillion, the biggest ever. All this from a GOP Congress who spent roughly a century promising to cut spending if only we elect them. Now, in theory, the Senate could still fix it. Unfortunately, the Senate will almost certainly make the bill worse. Because if you thought rhinos in the House are bad, say hello to the Senate. Senate rhinos are already talking about hiking spending on Medicaid, hiking spending on green energy, and even federal worker benefits, with Republicans like this who need Democrats. So what would a good bill look like? Ideally, it would include discretionary cuts, since that's where the waste and fraud lives. So USAID, EPA, the constellation of crony slush funds that keep the deep state in million-dollar waterfront mansions in Potomac. GOP leadership claims discretionary cannot be in the bill because of a procedural rule, the Byrd Rule. But in fact, the existing bill has discretionary. It's just all hikes in discretionary spending, including our grotesquely bloated military, which has not passed an audit in 35 years. Now, discretionary matters because that's how to codify the $175 billion of Doge cuts. But even without discretionary, there is a ton of room to improve the spending. So Senators Rand Paul, Ron Johnson, and Mike Lee want to reduce Medicaid and food stamp for the able-bodied, which seems like a no-brainer, want to reduce or eliminate federal subsidies for student loans, and repeal all of Biden's green energy handouts, as well as cutting military spending that apparently pays for other people's civil wars and patrols the Red Sea so Europe and China can trade, something maybe they should be paying for. But maybe the worst part is the current bill bundles the debt ceiling with the budget. Now, given Democrats are afraid to shut down government, that throws away any leverage for those future discretionary spending cuts. So what's next? Unfortunately, this disgusting pork-filled abomination is about as good as it gets from the rhinos in Congress. Given Trump is still backing the bill, perhaps for tactical reasons to keep Congress Republican, there is zero chance it gets better. It will get worse in the Senate. Republican primaries are coming up in 9 months. If Republican voters care enough, they'll start replacing rhinos with actual conservatives. If not, we're facing an ocean of red ink for decades or until bond markets finally break, at which point, as always, nobody saw it coming. Thanks for tuning in. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and go to petersaintange.com for daily videos and in-depth articles with charts and all the gory details. Okay, we'll be watching. See you next time.